I'm a 23-year-old guy, and up until recently, I lived with my 75-year-old grandfather in a small rural town. Our family has been in this town for generations, and most people around here know each other. The house where we lived belongs to my grandfather, and I've been staying there rent-free while trying to get through community college. It's a simple life, no fancy coffee shops, just a few local diners, a grocery store, and some farms on the outskirts. But things took a turn, and not in a good way. My parents live a few states away, and we haven't been on the best terms for a while. They didn't like my choice to go to community college instead of a big-name university, and they definitely had a lot to say when I decided to stay back in this town with my grandfather. I guess you could call it one of those classic family disagreements, but it's more than that. They've always been about keeping up appearances and pushing for careers they thought were prestigious. Meanwhile, I've been working part-time at the local grocery store, just trying to make ends meet while balancing classes. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. My paycheck from the grocery store barely covers my own expenses, so I've been relying on my grandfather's generosity to have a roof over my head. Now, my grandfather, he's got some old-fashioned views, to say the least. He believes in things like men being the breadwinners and women belonging in the kitchen, and he's not shy about sharing those opinions. I've tried to let it slide most of the time. He's from a different era, after all. But it's hard when you're living under the same roof and hearing it constantly. He's got this whole idea of what's proper and what's not, and it's like stepping back in time every time we have a conversation. It all blew up during a family dinner. My grandfather started going off about women in the workforce, saying stuff like they should just focus on raising kids and leave the real work to men. He made a comment about how he doesn't understand why women are trying to prove themselves when they should just be content at home. He thought it was just another one of his harmless rants, but I couldn't take it anymore. I spoke up and told him that his views were outdated and harmful. I tried to keep my tone steady, but I wasn't exactly subtle about it. I told him about my friends, guys, girls, non-binary folks, who all work hard and deserve respect, no matter what they do. That dinner went from awkward to hostile in record time. My grandfather's face turned red, and he got really quiet for a moment, like he was trying to process what I had just said. Then he slammed his fork down and told me that if I couldn't respect his beliefs, then maybe I didn't respect him at all. He gave me an ultimatum right then and there: apologize or get out. He said that as long as I was living under his roof, I should watch my mouth and respect the way he sees things. I knew what he meant. He wanted me to back down and pretend like I hadn't said anything. But I didn't. I couldn't. I told him I stood by what I said. I wasn't going to apologize for believing that everyone should have a fair shot and that being stuck in the past wasn't helping anyone. He gave me this cold, disappointed look and left the room without another word. That night, the air in the house felt different, heavier. I knew there was no going back from what I'd said. A few days later, the tension hadn't let up. We didn't talk much, just avoided each other as much as possible. Then, one morning, he came up to me, arms crossed, and told me he was serious about the ultimatum. I had a week to either apologize or pack my things and leave. I told him I wasn't going to change my mind. He didn't seem surprised, just turned around and walked away like he'd been expecting it. That week went by faster than I thought it would. I tried to reach out to a few friends for advice, but no one had any real solutions. They were supportive, saying things like, "You did the right thing," and "I wish I could help you out," but most of them were struggling to get by themselves. One friend even offered me his couch for a few nights, but he couldn't take me in long term. Everyone had their own bills to pay and their own challenges to deal with. I realized pretty quickly that I was on my own. When the week was up, my grandfather didn't waste any time. He told me to pack up my stuff and leave, and there wasn't any ceremony about it. I didn't have much, a few bags of clothes, my laptop, and some books. As I was packing, I kept thinking about how surreal it all felt. One minute I was living my life, thinking about midterms and my next shift at the grocery store, and the next I was being kicked out of the only home I'd known for the past few years. I didn't have a backup plan. The paycheck for my part-time job was barely enough to cover gas and food, let alone rent. I tried looking for a cheap motel, but even the rundown ones were out of my price range. So I started couch surfing, bouncing between friends' places whenever they could spare a spot for a night or two. It wasn't stable, but it was better than sleeping in my car, for now, at least. My grandfather didn't reach out. I think he expected me to come crawling back, asking for forgiveness, but I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Instead, I turned to social media, venting about the whole situation. The post got a lot more attention than I expected. Some people said I was brave for standing up, but others, especially some family members, called me ungrateful. They said I should have just kept my mouth shut and stayed under my grandfather's roof. It's funny how people love to judge when they aren't the ones living through it. And that's where I am now, sleeping on different couches, figuring out my next move, and trying to keep my head above water. I thought things would get easier after standing up for myself, but honestly, I've never felt more lost. Update 1. It didn't take long for reality to hit me once I was out of my grandfather's house. Couch surfing between friends seemed manageable at first, but I quickly realized how fragile that setup was, especially with winter creeping in. My car wasn't exactly equipped for the cold nights, and the idea of sleeping in it during a winter freeze was more terrifying than I thought. I spent those first few nights trying to figure out what my next move would be, scrolling through job postings on my phone until the battery died. I started applying for any full-time position I could find, warehouses, diners, even seasonal work at a tree lot. Anything that would give me enough income to scrape together rent for a cheap studio apartment. But no one was biting. A few interviews came and went, but every time I'd leave thinking I had a shot, the rejection emails would roll in a few days later. I thought I had a decent chance with one warehouse job, but they went with someone more experienced. Meanwhile, staying with friends got trickier. It didn't matter how much I tried to stay out of their way, tension was always in the air. One night, I overheard a friend complaining to their roommate about how I'd been on their couch for almost a week. They didn't know I could hear them from the hallway, but the message was clear. I was becoming a burden. So, I moved on to the next friend's place, trying to spread out the inconvenience, but deep down, I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. Then, out of the blue, my grandfather texted me. It wasn't a long message, just a question. Are you ready to apologize? He followed up with a comment about how his door was still open if I decided to come back. I could almost hear the smug tone through the screen, like he expected me to break down any day now. I left the message on read. I wasn't about to give in just because things got tough, but tough didn't even begin to describe it. The constant rejections, the feeling of being an unwanted guest, it all started to wear me down. The uncertainty of not knowing where I'd sleep next was messing with my head, making it hard to focus on anything else. My friends tried to be supportive, but it wasn't their job to carry me through this, and I could tell they were reaching their limit. The panic attacks started soon after, usually late at night when I'd stare up at the ceiling of someone's spare room or a borrowed couch, wondering how long I could keep this up. I turned to Reddit for advice, pouring my story out in a post. The response was overwhelming. People shared their own stories about breaking away from toxic family members, and a lot of them told me to stand my ground, saying that I'd made the right choice. Some even offered to buy me a meal if I was ever near their town. It was nice to feel heard, but it didn't change my situation. I still needed a job, a place to live, and something more than just encouragement to keep me going. Money was getting tight, and after burning through most of my savings on gas and cheap meals, I had no choice but to visit a food bank. Walking in there for the first time was a punch to the gut. I'd always thought of food banks as a last resort, and now here I was, standing in line with people who were just as desperate as me. The volunteers were kind, handing out bags of canned food and pasta, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't have been there. But I swallowed my pride because at that point, there wasn't room for anything else. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I got a call back for another warehouse job. It seemed like the break I needed. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was more than what I was making at the grocery store, and they had a position open immediately. I went to the interview, did my best to keep my hopes in check, and left feeling like maybe this time things would turn around. But a few days later, they let me know they'd gone with someone else. I stared at the email for a while, feeling that bit of hope drain away. Around the same time, my car decided to give up on me. It had been making weird noises for weeks, but I'd hoped it would hold out just a little longer. One cold morning, it wouldn't start at all. I tried to get a jump, but it was no use. Without my car, getting around, even to the grocery store, became a challenge. I started relying on the town's spotty bus system, which added hours to my commute and made me even more dependent on the few friends I still had left. As the days blurred into weeks, I started questioning everything. If I had just kept my mouth shut, I wouldn't be in this mess. But then I'd remember that text from my grandfather, and I'd feel that anger bubble up again. I couldn't go back on my word, not after all this, but it didn't stop me from staring at my dwindling bank balance, wondering how I was going to make it work with less than $50 to my name. Every now and then, someone would reach out with a small act of kindness. Like a guy who recognized me from my Reddit post and bought me lunch when he saw me at the diner, or a neighbor who handed me an extra blanket when they heard I was crashing in my car. Those moments helped, even if they were just drops in the bucket. But as time went on, more friends started pulling away. They had their own lives, their own problems, and I couldn't blame them for not wanting to deal with mine too. It was hard not to feel like I was slowly running out of options. With my last few dollars in my pocket, I had to face the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I'd have to go back to my grandfather and eat my words. But for now, I'm still trying to hold on, still looking for that one break that could change everything. Update 2. Things took a turn when I stumbled on a job opening at a local diner. It wasn't anything glamorous, just evening shifts bussing tables and doing some dishwashing, but I needed the money badly. I walked in looking a bit rough. I hadn't been sleeping well, and living out of bags didn't do much for my appearance, but the manager didn't seem to care. They were short-staffed, and as long as I could show up on time and keep up with the pace, the job was mine. I started the very next night. That same day, I got another text from my grandfather. This time, he wasn't beating around the bush. He told me that if I didn't come back soon and apologize, he'd consider his offer off the table for good. He threw in that he'd be changing the locks if I didn't show up by the end of the week. I knew he was trying to push me into a corner, make me feel like I had no other option. But the new job, even though it wasn't much, gave me a little bit of hope. I ignored the message and focused on getting through my first few shifts at the diner. Around that time, I got a bit of unexpected help. An acquaintance from my old part-time job at the grocery store heard about my situation. They had a spare room and offered to let me crash there temporarily, just until I got back on my feet. It wasn't much, just a mattress on the floor and space for my bags, but it was better than hopping between couches and worrying about overstaying my welcome. It also meant I wouldn't have to sleep in my car during the coldest nights. I took them up on it, promising to chip in for rent as soon as I could. With the roof over my head, I focused on the new job. The shifts were long and exhausting. I'd come back late at night, my back sore from hauling trays and washing endless stacks of dishes, but it paid a little better than my grocery job. I started to put together a plan. If I saved every penny and kept my expenses to the bare minimum, I might be able to afford a shared apartment in a month or two. It wasn't a sure thing, but it felt like a light at the end of the tunnel. Then, of course, things went sideways again. A couple of weeks into the new routine, I got sick, probably from the stress and barely eating enough. It hit hard, and I had to take a few days off from work. Those days off meant I missed a few shifts, and with it, a chunk of my paycheck. I tried to push through, but I ended up collapsing at the diner during a shift. My manager sent me home, and I spent the next few days in bed at my acquaintance's place, unable to do much more than sleep and drink whatever soup they managed to scrape together for me. Someone on Reddit suggested I start a GoFundMe after I shared what was happening. I didn't want to at first, it felt too much like begging, but desperation won out, and I set it up, explaining the situation as best I could. Donations started trickling in, small amounts mostly, but each one made a difference. There were also comments from people accusing me of looking for handouts, saying I should swallow my pride and go back to my grandfather. I ignored those and tried to focus on the support that was coming in, but it was hard not to let the negative voices get to me. While all this was happening, my grandfather sent what he called his final message. It was blunt. He told me he'd already changed the locks and that he wouldn't take me back even if I begged. He made it clear that I was no longer welcome and hoped I'd learn my lesson. I read it, then blocked his number. It felt like a door slamming shut, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. After a week or so, I started to feel better and managed to get back to work at the diner. It was just in time to scrape together enough cash to give my acquaintance some rent money as a thank you for letting me stay. They didn't ask for much, but paying even a little bit made me feel like I wasn't just freeloading. Things were still tight, but at least I wasn't going back to sleeping in my car. Around this time, a few more family members tried to get involved, messaging me to say I was the one tearing the family apart. They claimed my grandfather's health had been affected by all the stress and that I should just apologize and go back. I didn't want to hear it. I blocked their numbers too and focused on keeping my head down at work. It wasn't easy, but my new coworkers started to become friends. We'd chat during slow shifts, and sometimes they'd bring in leftovers from home, offering me a bit more than I'd been eating on my own. Those small gestures made a bigger difference than they knew. After a few more weeks, I finally had my first night where I didn't wake up wondering where I'd go next. The mattress on the floor wasn't luxurious, but it was mine for the time being, and that was enough. I posted an update on Reddit, sharing that for the first time in months, I felt like I had a chance to rebuild. People in the comments were encouraging, celebrating the small win with me. That's when an old high school friend reached out after seeing my post. They'd recently moved to a nearby town and had a spare room they were willing to rent out at a cheap price. It was further away, but the rent was low enough that I could afford it on my diner wages. It felt like the break I'd been waiting for, a chance to start fresh somewhere new. I took them up on the offer, and we made plans for me to move in the following week. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the first time in a long while that I could see a future where I wasn't living day to day, and maybe, just maybe, I'd finally find some stability again. Thank you very much for watching to the story so far. I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss tomorrow's stories.